The Louisville and Nashville Railroad, commonly called the L&amp, was a Class I railroad that operated freight and passenger services in the southeast United States. Chartered by the Commonwealth of Kentucky in 1850, the road grew into one of the great success stories of American business, operating under one name continuously for 132 years. It survived Civil War and economic depression and several waves of social and technological change. Under Milton H. Smith, president of the company for 30 years, the L&amp grew from a road with less than 300 miles of track to a 6,000-mile system serving 13 states. As one of the premier southern railroads, the L&amp extended its reach far beyond its namesake cities, stretching to St. Louis, Memphis, Atlanta, and New Orleans. The railroad was economically strong throughout its lifetime, operating both freight and passenger trains in a manner that earned it the nickname, the Old Reliable. Growth of the railroad continued until its purchase and the tumultuous rail consolidations of the 1980s, which led to continual successes. By the end of 1970, L&amp operated 6,063 miles of road on 10,051 miles of track, not including the Carrollton Railroad. In 1971, the Seaboard Coastline Railroad, successor to the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, purchased the remainder of the L&amp shares it did not already own, and the company became a subsidiary. By 1982, the railroad industry was consolidating quickly, and the Seaboard Coastline absorbed the Louisville and Nashville Railroad entirely. Then in 1986, the Seaboard system merged with the C&amp-O and B&amp-O, and the new combined system was known as the Chassis System. Soon after, the combined company became CSX Transportation, which now owns and operates all of the former Louisville and Nashville lines. Early history and Civil War. Its first line extended barely south of Louisville, Kentucky, and it took until 1859 to span the 180-odd miles to its second namesake city of Nashville. There were about 250 miles of track in the system by the outbreak of the Civil War, and its strategic location, spanning the Union-Confederate lines, made it of great interest to both governments. During the Civil War, different parts of the network were pressed into service by both armies at various times, and considerable damage from wear, battle, and sabotage occurred. However, the company benefited from being based in the Union state of Kentucky, and the fact that Nashville fell to Union forces within the first year of the war and remained in the hands for its duration. It profited from northern haulage contracts for troops and supplies, paid in sound federal greenbacks, as opposed to the rapidly depreciating Confederate dollars. After the war, other railroads in the South were devastated to the point of collapse, and the general economic depression meant that labor and materials to repair its roads could be had fairly cheaply. Buoyed by these fortunate circumstances, the firm began an expansion that never really stopped. Within 30 years, the network reached from Ohio and Missouri to Louisiana and Florida. By 1884, the firm had such importance that it was included in the Dow Jones Transportation Average, the first American stock market index. It was such a large customer of the Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works, the country's second-largest locomotive maker, that in 1879 the firm presented L&amp with a free locomotive as a thank-you bonus. Coal and capital in the Gilded Age. Since all locomotives of the time were steam-powered, many railroads had favored coal as their engine's fuel source after wood-burning models were found unsatisfactory. The L&amp guaranteed not only its own fuel sources but a steady revenue stream by pushing its lines into the difficult but coal-rich terrain of eastern Kentucky, and also well into northern Alabama. There the small town of Birmingham had recently been founded amidst undeveloped deposits of coal, iron ore and limestone, the basic ingredients of steel production. The arrival of L&amp and transport and investment capital helped create a great industrial city and the South's first post-war urban success story. The railroad's access to good coal enabled it to claim for a few years starting in 1940 the nation's longest unrefueled run, about 490 miles from Louisville to Montgomery, Alabama. In the Gilded Age of the late 19th century there were no such things as antitrust or fair competition laws and very little financial regulation. Business was a keen and mean affair, and the L&amp was a formidable competitor. It would exclude upstarts like the Tennessee Central Railway Company from critical infrastructure like urban stations, where that wasn't possible, as with the Nashville, Chattanooga and St. Louis Railway. It simply used its financial muscle. In 1880 it acquired a controlling interest in its chief competitor. A public outcry convinced the L&amp directors that there were limits to the power. They discreetly continued the NC&amp STL as a separate subsidiary, but now working with, instead of in competition with, the L&amp. Ironically, in 1902 financial speculations by financier J.P. Morgan delivered control of the L&amp to its rival Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, but that company made no attempt to control L&amp operations, and for many decades there were no consequences of this change. 20th century. The World Wars brought heavy demand to the L&amp. Its widespread and robust network coped well with the demands of war transport and production, and the resulting profits harked back to the boost it had received from the Civil War. In the post-war period, the line shifted gradually to diesel power, and the new streamlined engines pulled some of the most elegant passenger trains of the last great age of passenger rail, such as the Dixie Flyer, the Hummingbird, and the Pan American. Though well past its 100th anniversary, the line was still growing. In 1957, the Nashville, Chattanooga and Amp St. Louis was finally fully merged. In the 1960s, acquisitions in Illinois allowed a long-sought entry into the premier railroad nexus of Chicago, and some of the battered remains of the old rival, the Tennessee Central, were sold to the L&amp as well. In 1971, the Seaboard Coast Line Railroad, successor to the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, purchased the remainder of the L&amp shares it did not already own, and the company became a subsidiary. During this period, in common with other lines, the L&amp was cutting back passenger service. Amtrak, the government-formed passenger railway service, took over the few remaining L&amp passenger trains in 1971. In 1979, amid great lamentations in the press, it ceased passenger service to its namesake cities when Amtrak discontinued the Floridian, which had connected Louisville with Nashville, and to Florida via Birmingham. By 1982 the railroad industry was consolidating quickly, and the Seaboard Coast Line absorbed the Louisville and Nashville Railroad entirely. The merged company was known as SCL, L&amp, Family Lines, and was depicted as such on the railroad's rolling stock. During the next few years, several smaller acquisitions resulted in the creation of the Seaboard System Railroad, yet more consolidation was ahead, and in 1986, the Seaboard System merged into the C&amp-O combined system known as the Chassis System. The combined company became CSX Transportation, which now owns and operates all of the former Louisville and Nashville lines. Legacy. A number of historical groups and publications devoted to the line exist, and L&amp equipment is well represented in the model railroading hobby. The L&amp Railroad is also the subject of at least two songs, the 2003 Rhonda Vincent bluegrass song Kentucky Borderline, and the L&amp Don't Stop Here Anymore by Gene Ritchie and individually performed by Michelle Shocked, Johnny Cash and Kathy Mattea. Dutch blues rock band The Bintangs had a hit in the Dutch charts in the late 1960s with Ridin' on the L&amp passenger operations, while the Hummingbird and Pan American, both from Cincinnati to New Orleans and Memphis, were two of the L&amp's most popular passenger trains that ran entirely on its own lines. However, the Hummingbird later added a Chicago to New Orleans section in conjunction with the Chicago and Amp Eastern Illinois Railroad utilizing the Georgian north of Nashville. The railroad also hosted other named trains, including His Alien ran combined with the Washington, Atlanta, New Orleans Express. These trains combined south of Montgomery. Pre-Amtrak Crescent, Dixie Flagler, Dixie Flyer and Dixie Limited, Dixieland, Dixiana, Flamingo, Georgian, Gulf Wind, Piedmont Limited, Southland, Southwind. The L&amp was one of few railroads to discontinue a passenger train that was en route. On January 9, 1969, as soon as a judge lifted the injunction preventing its discontinuance, the L&amp discontinued its southbound Hummingbird at Birmingham, in mid-run from Cincinnati to New Orleans. The 14 passengers continuing south did so by bus. Lebanon Branch. Construction began on the Lebanon Branch in 1857. The line branched off the main line that went from Louisville to Nashville in Lebanon Junction. The Lebanon Branch switching on the main line in Lebanon Junction gave the town its name. The Lebanon Branch was 77 miles across Kentucky from Lebanon Junction, Kentucky to Mount Vernon, Kentucky, then on to Sinks, Kentucky. The line crossed through the towns Lebanon Junction, Boston, Nelsonville, Lyons Station, New Haven, New Hope, St. Francis, Loretto, Street, Marys, Lebanon, Gravel Switch, Junction City, Crab Orchard, Mount Vernon, and Sinks. At first, the line was used during the Civil War hauling supplies and troops. Later, the Greensburg branch was built switching off the Lebanon branch on the outskirts of Lebanon, making its way through Campbellsville, Kentucky, and on to the end of the line in Greensburg, Kentucky. The Lebanon branch had several trains traveling on it, such as Lebanon's local trains Nos. 21 and 22, along with the mail and express train, the Flamingo, and freight trains. The line stayed this way until passenger service ended in the 1950s. After this, freight trains occupied the line with coal trains from the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky. The line continued under this operation until the 1980s, when the Lebanon branch and the rest of the L&amp system came under control of the Seaboard System Railroad. The L&amp and Seaboard merged, and later, Seaboard and the chassis system merged to create CSX. With multiple branch lines through the area, the decision was made that the Lebanon branch was to be abandoned and taken up. In 1991, the last train came through Lebanon. A portion of the Lebanon branch was removed a few months later between Mount Vernon to New Hope. A portion of the branch from Mount Vernon to Sinks was saved by CSX and is still in use today for small local freight trains, as well as a portion of the branch from Boston to Lebanon Junction. The portion of the branch from New Hope to Lebanon Junction is preserved by the Kentucky Railway Museum, which purchased the line from New Hope to Boston. The Kentucky Railway Museum operates passenger trains for tourists and visitors from their headquarters in New Haven to Boston. The museum hauls 3 to 7 passenger cars with the steam locomotive L&amp N152, or one of the historical diesels like the Monon BL2 number 32 or ex-Santa Fe CF7 number 2,546. Preservation. There are several preservation organizations of L&amp and equipment and L&amp and lines, such as the Kentucky Railway Museum, the Historic Rail Park and Train Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and the L&amp and Historic Society. The city of Atlanta, Georgia is home to the General and the Texas 2440 locomotives originally built for the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which was later leased to L&amp and predecessor Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis. The lease of the W&amp was passed to and renewed by L&amp and its successors. The General and the Texas became famous for being participants in the Great Locomotive Chase during the Civil War. The General had been placed on display in the Railroad's Union Depot in Chattanooga in 1901. In 1957, the L&amp removed the engine and restored it to operating condition. The engine pulled the railroad's wooden center door Jim Crow combined coach No. 665 as it traveled throughout the eastern U.S. as part of the observance of the Civil War centennial, including a visit to the 1964 New York World's Fair. Between 1966 and 1971, illegal battle ensued between the railroad and the city of Chattanooga, as the former had planned to send the engine to Georgia, while the latter claimed to be the owners of the engine. After the dispute was settled, the engine was formally presented to the state of Georgia in 1971. The engine currently resides at the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Kennesaw, Georgia, while the Texas is currently at the North Carolina Transportation Museum in Spencer, North Carolina, undergoing restoration for inclusion into an addition to house it and the cyclorama painting of the Battle of Atlanta. The Texas should return to Georgia in late 2016. The Kentucky Railway Museum consists of many pieces of L&amp and equipment, as well as a portion of the Lebanon Branch. The museum owns the following L&amp and equipment: K2A Light Pacific 462 number 152, a steam locomotive, heavyweight coaches Nos. 2572 and 2554, an observation car, heavyweight combined No. 1603, combined coach number 665, sleeper the Pearl River, the Pullman coach Mount Broderick, which was used by the L&amp and several baggage cars, a steam-powered crane, and E6 diesel locomotive No. 770. All of the last 7 pieces of equipment listed need restoration. The Historic Rail Park and Train Museum owns or operates several pieces of L&amp and equipment, including an E8 diesel locomotive, a railway post office car, dining car number 2799, a sleeping car, an observation car, along with a Jim Crow combine in need of major overhaul. There are several other museums that own L&amp and equipment, including the Bluegrass Railroad Museum,